Under the reign of the seventh Hung King, the flow of Van Lang entered a new rhythm of development. It was not marked by the turbulence of conflict, nor by the inward stillness of a purely spiritual age, but by something quieter and far more enduring, the steady, widespread imprint of human hands upon the world. If the sixth dynasty had taught society how to confront instability in the limits of raw strength, then the seventh dynasty marked a return to creation, shaping life through labor, skill, and growing refinement. This was the moment when craftsmanship ceased to be a secondary activity and became a structural pillar of Van Lang's economy, society, and belief system. To those living in this era, it felt like a time when life took form. Everyday objects were no longer made simply to be used and discarded. They carried the clear signature of hands, villages, and family traditions. Bronze casting, pottery, and weaving did not merely expand in scale, they deepened in technical sophistication. Craftsmen no longer relied solely on instinct. Instead, they followed unspoken rules of proportion, temperature, timing, and sequence. This knowledge was never written down. It was stored in the body, in the feel of clay beneath the fingers, in the color of molten metal at its perfect moment, in the sound of a loom when the threads were pulled just right. Bronze casting during the seventh Hung dynasty in particular reveals the growing maturity of Van Lang society. Bronze was no longer limited to simple tools. It became a medium for objects rich in symbolism. Axes, spears, and plow blades were refined to be stronger and more durable, increasing productivity and easing physical strain. Alongside them appeared ceremonial bronze objects, drums, ritual vessels, bells, decorated weapons, and burial goods. These items did not produce food, but they produced something equally vital: spiritual order. They affirmed social roles, anchored rituals, and connected the living community to the unseen world. What is especially striking is that bronze craftsmanship did not evolve into a form of individual power. Skilled artisans were respected, but never separated from the collective. Foundries were communal, tied to villages and regions rather than to single figures. Casting a large ritual drum or ceremonial object was a shared endeavor, from gathering raw materials and preparing molds to tending the fire and performing rituals before and after the casting. As a result, each object carried the memory of an entire community, not merely material value. Under the seventh Hung dynasty, the bronze casting village was not simply a place of production. It was a living organism within Van Lang society, breathing in rhythm with the seasons, the rituals, and the collective memory of the people. To understand these villages is to understand how an early civilization learned to transform raw matter into meaning, and how technical skill gradually became inseparable from belief, authority, and identity. A bronze casting village in this era was often situated near rivers or streams, not by chance but by necessity. Water carried clay for molds, cooled heated metal, and symbolically linked the act of casting to the wider cosmology of Van Lang, where water was the source of life and continuity. The village itself did not appear grand or monumental. From a distance, it looked like any other settlement: houses of wood and thatch, paths of packed earth, the sounds of daily life. But beneath this simplicity lay a deep concentration of knowledge passed down through generations. Bronze casting was never the work of a single individual. It was a collective process that unfolded over time, involving many hands and many roles. Some villagers were responsible for sourcing copper and tin, materials that were not always locally available. This required trade networks extending beyond the immediate region, suggesting that bronze villages were also nodes of exchange and communication. Others specialized in preparing clay for molds, a task demanding patience and sensitivity. The clay had to be neither too dry nor too wet, neither too coarse nor too fine. This balance was learned not through written instruction, but through repeated bodily experience. The making of molds itself was an art form. Patterns were carved or pressed into clay with deliberate care. These designs, spirals, lines, geometric rhythms, were not decorative excess. They carried symbolic weight, echoing water currents, the movement of the sun, or the cyclical nature of life. When a mold cracked or failed, it was not dismissed lightly. It was read as a sign, perhaps of imbalance, haste, or a missing ritual step. Failure was not merely technical, it was moral and spiritual, prompting reflection rather than blame. When the time came to melt the metal, the atmosphere within the village subtly changed. Fires burned hotter and longer, movements became more restrained, speech softened. Even without formal prohibition, people understood that this was a moment requiring focus and respect. Molten bronze was not perceived as inert material, but as matter in transformation, dangerous, powerful, and alive. Watching metal shift from solid to liquid was for many a reminder of the thin boundary between the visible world and unseen forces. Pouring the molten bronze into molds was the most critical moment of all. Too fast, and the mold could crack. Too slow, and the metal would not flow evenly. Timing was everything. Elders often stood nearby, not to command, but to witness. Their presence affirmed continuity, linking the present act to generations before. When the casting succeeded, it was not celebrated loudly. Satisfaction was quiet, shared through glances and gestures, reflecting a culture that valued restraint over display. Once cooled and removed from its mold, a bronze object was never considered complete immediately. Edges were refined, surfaces smoothed, details clarified. This finishing work could take days, sometimes weeks, depending on the object's purpose. Tools intended for agriculture were treated with seriousness but efficiency. Ritual objects, however, received extraordinary attention. Their surfaces were polished until they caught light in specific ways, allowing them to interact visually with fire, sunlight, and movement during ceremonies. The village understood clearly that not all bronze objects were equal. A plow blade carried the weight of survival, a ritual drum carried the weight of the cosmos. These distinctions governed how objects were stored, transported, and revealed. Certain items were kept hidden until specific times of the year, brought out only when the community gathered in ritual alignment. The act of unveiling such objects was often as significant as their creation. Within the Bronze Village, knowledge moved vertically through generations and horizontally across households. Children grew up watching, listening, absorbing rhythms and sequences long before they were allowed to participate. Apprenticeship was informal but rigorous. Mistakes were corrected gently, often without words. A misplaced movement, an incorrect pressure, a moment of impatience, these were addressed through repetition rather than reprimand. Over time, the body learned what the mind could not articulate. Importantly, bronze villages did not exist in isolation. They were deeply embedded within the social structure of Van Lang. Surrounding communities depended on them for tools and ritual objects, while the bronze villages depended on agricultural settlements for food and materials. This mutual dependence prevented the concentration of unchecked power. Even the most skilled bronze village could not dominate others because its survival depended on balance rather than control. The authority of the Hung King during this period was closely tied to these villages, but not through ownership. The king did not command bronze production directly. Instead, royal legitimacy flowed through the ability to mobilize craftsmanship at key moments, festivals, funerals, seasonal rites. When a large bronze object appeared at a ceremony, it signaled not wealth, but harmony between villages, between labor and belief, between human effort and cosmic order. For modern audiences, especially those accustomed to industrial production, it is important to understand how profoundly different this relationship with material was. Bronze was not mass-produced, nor was it disposable. Each object carried time within it, the time of gathering materials, of preparation, of waiting, of ritual pause. To hold a bronze object was to hold accumulated labor and shared intention. This is why such objects were treated with reverence, even fear. The bronze casting village also shaped how people understood permanence. In a world where houses could rot and tools could break, bronze endured. Its durability made it suitable for objects meant to outlast individual lives. Burial goods, ceremonial drums, symbolic weapons, all spoke to a desire to project meaning across generations. Bronze became a bridge between the living and the ancestral past, anchoring memory in physical form. Yet despite this sense of permanence, bronze villages did not pursue endless accumulation. Production was measured, purposeful. Objects were made when needed, not stockpiled. This restraint reflects a worldview in which excess was destabilizing. Too much bronze would disrupt balance, attract conflict, or offend spiritual forces. What mattered was sufficiency aligned with ritual timing. In the collective memory of Van Lang, bronze villages became places of quiet power. They did not generate legends of conquest, but stories of patience, discipline, and mastery. They embodied a civilization that understood strength not only as force, but as control over fire, over material, over oneself. Through these villages, the seventh
Alongside bronze, pottery reached a level of stability and diversity rarely seen before. Pottery was no longer only for cooking or storage, it became part of spiritual life. Decorative patterns were not random, repeating motifs, waves, rice grains, birds, stylized human figures formed a shared visual language. These designs reflected the Van Lang worldview and allowed different communities to recognize one another as part of the same cultural space. Pottery villages were typically established in areas with high-quality clay, near rivers or wetlands where alluvial soil accumulated season after season. The people of Van Lang did not view clay as an inert resource, but as an extension of the body of the earth itself. Before extracting it, they observed its color, its pliability, its scent, and the sensation it created when held in the hand. Some types of clay were reserved for coarse, everyday household items, while others were set aside for ritual vessels or burial objects. This distinction was never written into formal rules, yet it existed as shared knowledge, passed down through generations by experience and observation. The rhythm of pottery villages followed the agricultural calendar. During periods of lighter farm work, the sounds of pounding and kneading clay echoed steadily through the settlement. The clay was cleaned, impurities removed, and then mixed with water in proportions that only experienced hands could judge accurately. Too much water, and the clay would collapse. Too little, and it would crack. This balance could not be measured with tools. It was felt through pressure, elasticity, and the subtle response of the material to slow, deliberate movements of the palms. In this way, knowledge was embodied rather than recorded. Pottery shaping during the 7th Hung King dynasty relied primarily on hand-building techniques and simple early potter's wheels. Each vessel, whether a jar, pot, or bowl, clearly bore the mark of its maker. No two pieces were ever completely identical, and this difference was not considered a flaw, but a sign of vitality. The potter did not attempt to erase the trace of their hands, but accepted it as part of the object itself. This reflects a profound worldview. Humans were not external to what they created, but present within it. Decorative patterns were applied while the clay was still damp, using wooden tools, cords, shells, or simply fingertips. These lines, dots, spirals, wave motifs, rice grain symbols, and stylized figures were not random ornaments. They were a way for the people of Van Lang to inscribe their understanding of the world onto material form. Waves evoked rivers and life itself. Rice grains symbolized abundance. Repeating geometric patterns expressed cyclical time. Each motif was a fragment of collective memory, repeated so that it would not be forgotten. Once shaped, pottery was not fired immediately. Pieces were left to dry slowly in shaded areas, protected from harsh sunlight so that moisture could evaporate evenly. This stage demanded great patience. Even slight haste could cause cracking and ruin days of work. Potters therefore learned to wait and to observe, accepting that certain processes could not be accelerated. This lesson extended far beyond pottery, shaping how the people of Van Lang approached life itself. Kilns during the 7th dynasty were usually earthen, semi-subterranean structures that took advantage of natural terrain. Firing pottery lacked the dramatic tension of bronze casting, but still required intense focus. The fire had to be steady, neither too strong nor too weak. Firing could last many hours, sometimes days, depending on the size and purpose of the vessels. The final color of the pottery was never entirely under human control, but the result of a dialogue between clay and flame. This element of uncertainty inspired humility and respect. Each firing carried a quiet sense of anticipation. When pottery emerged from the kiln, villagers did not judge it by appearance alone. They listened to the sound it produced when lightly tapped, felt its weight, and ran their fingers across its surface. A good piece was not only visually balanced, but true in sound. A clear, resonant tone indicated internal harmony. This multi-sensory evaluation reveals how the people of Van Lang understood quality, not through abstraction, but through lived experience. Pottery in the 7th Hung Qing dynasty served multiple layers of life. Everyday items such as cooking pots, jars, and storage vessels were made thick and durable, designed to withstand constant use. Ritual, funerary, and ceremonial pottery, however, was thinner, more carefully shaped, and more richly decorated. Some vessels were never meant to hold food or water, but existed solely within sacred spaces, acting as intermediaries between the living and their ancestors. This differentiation reflects a society sufficiently stable to separate the practical from the sacred. Pottery villages did not exist in isolation. They were woven into the broader network of Van Lang communities. Pottery was exchanged for rice, woven cloth, or bronze tools from other villages. In this way, ceramic vessels carried with them not only function, but style, identity, and stories of their place of origin. When a pot from one village appeared in another, it represented a social relationship as much as a utilitarian object. Knowledge of pottery making was transmitted organically. Children grew up surrounded by the smell of damp clay, kiln ash, and rows of drying vessels along village paths. They learned by watching, touching, and assisting with small tasks, long before shaping their own pieces. There was no formal initiation into the craft, only a quiet recognition when elders sensed that a child's hands had become patient and sensitive enough to work with clay. Spiritually, pottery villages contributed to a defining virtue of Van Lang culture: resilience without display. Pottery rarely produced moments of spectacle. It involved repetition, long cycles of trial and error, infrequent failure. Yet through repetition, people learned refinement, acceptance of limits, and harmony with forces beyond their control. This was a form of silent education, deep, steady, and transformative. In relation to authority, pottery lacked the overt symbolism of bronze, yet it was present everywhere. The power of the Hung kings and local leaders was expressed through the ability to coordinate pottery for rituals, funerals, and communal gatherings. When ceremonial vessels appeared in the right quantity, at the right time, and in the right form, social order was reinforced quietly, without the need for commands or coercion. For modern audiences, especially YouTube viewers accustomed to speed, efficiency, and mass production, the story of Van Lang's pottery villages offers an alternative vision of progress. Here, progress is not measured by doing more faster, but by moving in the right rhythm. Each pot and vessel represents time respected, materials listened to, and human intention restrained enough to preserve balance. Thus, the pottery villages of the 7th Hung Qing dynasty left behind more than archaeological artifacts. They left an early lesson in civilization, that a rich and enduring way of life can be built without separating humanity from nature, without dominating materials, but through patient dialogue with earth, water, and fire. In the quiet presence of these clay vessels, one can still sense the long breath of Van Lang, slow, resilient, and profoundly grounded.
Weaving, too, took on meaning far beyond clothing the body. Fabric became a marker of order, ritual, and identity. Colors, patterns, and weaving techniques varied by region, yet all followed a shared sense of harmony. Cloth worn during labor differed from that worn in festivals. The garments of elders differed from those of the young. These distinctions were not rigid social hierarchies, but gentle signals, helping each person understand their place within the broader rhythm of life. In the worldview of the people of Van Long, cloth was never merely something to cover the body. It was seen as a second skin of the community, something that accompanied a person from birth until their return to the ancestors. For this reason, weaving was not considered secondary labor. It was a silent pillar of social stability. Under the 7th Hung King, as society achieved relative agricultural security and social order, weaving was able to develop in depth, technically refined, visually diverse, and increasingly rich in spiritual meaning. The raw materials for weaving during this period came almost entirely from the surrounding natural environment. Fibers from ramie, jute, coarse silk, and other indigenous plants. Cultivating, harvesting, and processing these fibers was a long chain of work requiring patience and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Weaving was never separated from natural cycles. The timing of fiber collection, drying, spinning, and weaving followed the seasons, humidity, sunlight, and wind. When these rhythms were ignored, fibers weakened, cloth became rough, and colors faded quickly. To weave well was to understand nature rather than to dominate it. The looms used during the 7th Hung King's reign were structurally simple but remarkably stable. The steady sound of weaving became a familiar presence in villages, blending into daily life like breathing itself. Weaving was never rushed. Each movement of the shuttle required controlled strength. Each tightening of the threads demanded precision. A piece of cloth was not created in a moment, but through thousands of repeated motions, where even a small mistake could compromise the entire structure. One defining feature of weaving during this era was the close relationship between technique and memory. Skills were not taught through abstract explanations, but through observation, imitation, and lived experience. Children grew up beside looms, familiar with the smell of dried fibers, the colors of natural dyes, and the stories told during long hours of work. When a person was finally able to complete an entire piece of cloth on their own, it marked not only technical competence, but a form of spiritual maturity. Cloth in this period was never uniform. Coarse fabrics were made for labor, built to endure sun and rain, easily repaired and reused. Finer cloth served everyday life, and then there were special textiles, woven slowly and carefully for rituals, festivals, marriages, and funerals. This differentiation did not create rigid social classes, but rather a symbolic order, helping each individual understand their place within the community and the cycle of life. Colors were derived entirely from natural dyes, leaves, bark, roots, and minerals. Dyeing required precise knowledge of soaking time, temperature, and exposure to light. A beautiful color was not one that was bright, but one that endured. This reflected the aesthetic philosophy of Van Long. Beauty lay in harmony and longevity, not in momentary display. When patterns appeared on cloth, they were often simple yet rhythmic. Repeating lines, alternating colors, and subtle geometric forms reflected how the people of Van Long perceived the world, as cyclical, continuous, and interconnected. Cloth became a wordless language, with each piece quietly telling a story of land, family, and collective memory without explanation. In the spiritual worldview of the people of Van Long, cloth was never merely something to cover the body. It was seen as a second skin of the community, something that accompanied a person from birth until their return to the ancestors. For this reason, weaving was not considered secondary labor. It was a silent pillar of social stability. Within the social structure, weavers did not hold political power, yet they occupied a position of deep respect. They ensured that the community was physically and spiritually clothed. At every major moment, birth, coming of age, marriage, death, cloth was present. Its role was quiet but irreplaceable. Weaving also shaped gender roles in a subtle way. Through this craft, Women exercised a form of quiet authority, the authority of preservation. They did not command armies or preside over grand rituals, but they created the material and spiritual foundation upon which all rituals and daily life depended. It was a form of power that did not seek attention, yet endured across generations. Viewed from a modern perspective, especially for contemporary audiences accustomed to speed and mass production, weaving during the 7th Hung King's reign offers a different lesson about development. Value was not measured by quantity, but by appropriateness. A good piece of cloth was not one made quickly, but one made in the right rhythm. It lasted, was repaired, passed down, and absorbed the memory of its users. As Van Long gradually moved beyond the 7th Hung King's era into periods of greater change, weaving continued quietly in the background, like an underground current. It did not produce heroic legends, but it sustained resilience. It left no monuments of conquest, yet it preserved continuity. And within those interwoven threads, we can recognize a fundamental truth of ancient Vietnamese civilization. A society endures not only through strength or authority, but through patient hands that day after day weave the durability of life.
As craftsmanship advanced, agricultural tools improved as well. Plow blades, hoes, axes, and knives became stronger and more reliable, allowing people to work the land more efficiently without rapidly expanding their territory. This was a strategic choice, increasing productivity on familiar land rather than constantly seeking new ground. As a result, the 7th Hung dynasty maintained social stability while gradually raising living standards. Improved tools did not drive people toward exhaustion. Instead, they created time, new spaces within daily life. These moments allowed experimentation, learning, and refinement. Agriculture supported craftsmanship, and craftsmanship, in turn, elevated agriculture. Together, they formed a closed cycle of sustainable development. Craftsmanship during this period was inseparable from belief. Artisans were not merely workers, they were guardians of knowledge considered partially sacred. Before casting bronze or weaving cloth for rituals, small ceremonies were performed. Quiet gestures, whispered words, shared pauses to seek the blessing of ancestors and spirits. Labor itself was a spiritual act. Creating an object meant participating in the maintenance of cosmic balance as Van Lang understood it. Power during the 7th Hung dynasty was therefore not primarily expressed through warfare or legend, but through the ability to organize production and circulation. Authority belonged to those who could coordinate labor, distribute crafted goods, and ensure that ritual objects appeared at the right time and place. The Hung King remained the central symbol, yet royal power was felt less through commands and more through the orderly flow of tools, ceremonies, and seasons. Notably, despite the growth of craftsmanship, Van Lang's society did not pursue excess or display. Refinement was always paired with restraint. There was no obsession with limitless accumulation. Objects were made to be durable, meaningful, and beautiful, but never for personal extravagance. This reflects a clear labor ethic. Craftsmanship served the community and shared ritual life, not individual distinction. In the legends and collective memory emerging from this era, people increasingly appeared as makers rather than warriors alone. Stories of skilled hands, patience, and learning from parents and neighbors became more common. These narratives reveal a society beginning to see itself not merely as a group struggling to survive, but as a creative civilization, one capable of shaping its world with intention, care, and continuity.